denizens of the night. Welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Broadcasting live from the spookiest sandcastle you've ever seen, I will be your guide through the witching hours. Tonight, we'll take a relaxing walk along the beach. Our story opens as a young man takes a pause during his run down by the ocean. As he decides to head back and resume his routine, he meets two young ladies. One of them warns him to stay away from the water at low tide, because there have been many disappearances over the years as the tide has rolled out. Of course, he dismisses their warning at first, but he quickly becomes a believer when the first hand grabs his ankle from within the mud. This story is called Low Tide and was written by J.L. Goodwin, 1990. You can always tell when the tide is out. That was the thought Jared Dellinger had in his head as he rounded the corner down the hill towards the parking lot and the beach beyond. It was a smell he was intimately familiar with. He'd always taken a 5-minute break from his jog down by the water so the salt air could clear his nose and help him sleep better. It's not really just one smell, though. And that was true as well. It was really a mix of smells. The now exposed mud flats on both sides of the estuary, the seaweed left behind by the outgoing water to be collected again later, and the tidal pools that magnified the sea salt's aroma twice as much. He reached the bottom of the hill, the asphalt leveling out in front of him, and broke into a sprint for the last stint before slowing to allow his body to cool off. A visible sheet of sweat covered his face, but he smiled regardless. He was proud of himself. And why shouldn't he be? Less than 3 months since I quit smoking, and I'm already able to exercise this hard and long? It's a freaking miracle. If I hadn't screwed up, I could have made a damn good athlete. He let out a soft, slightly winded laugh. He'd used to swim professionally back in middle school, even won a couple of awards for it. His instructors often commented that he could make it to the Olympic swim team if he put the effort in. But that had been before he'd gotten into high school, where, despite having so much going for him education-wise, he'd let himself fall in with a shady group in some vain, desperate attempt to find somewhere to belong. Even so, after 12 years of smoking half a pack a day, he wasn't that bad in the looks department. His teeth had yellowed slightly from the nicotine, but he remedied it by buying whitening strips from the store. His body still held the slightly muscular, thin swimmer's physique he'd had at 17. And, as people often told him, he looked more than a little younger than he actually was. Something which, when he was just moving into adulthood, he'd found irritating. But now, just a year shy of 30, he thanked the Lord above for. He shook his head to clear his thoughts, pushing the bangs out of his eyes. Glancing to the right, he quickly scanned the Coast Guard maintenance shack that marked the end of the buildings before the final 20 feet to the water. As usual, it stood dark and abandoned. He'd never seen anyone in there in the 5 years he'd lived in Coos Bay. Crossing the final few parking spaces with long strides, he reached up and pulled his headphones off, slinging them around his neck. He reached into the pocket of his sweatpants and pulled out his phone, unlocking the screen and stopping the exercise tracking app. It was routine to him by now. Pause the tracker, walk down the boat launch to one of the 2 docks that flanked either side of it, and stand there for a few minutes admiring the sunset. Then take a quick walk down the beach, drinking in the sights, sounds, and smells, and finally finish the last half mile to his apartment. Today appeared to be ready to give him one hell of a view to end the day. Off to his left, over the far bank of the estuary that separated it from the Pacific, the sky was a deep, dark shade of red, as the sun slipped below the horizon. It almost gave the appearance of viewing the world through a bottle of red wine. On the right, trailing the coming darkness of night, storm clouds were visible, pushing their way across the sky with all of the self-assured arrogance of a high school bully searching for a dork to steal lunch money from. Jared frowned slightly. He'd watched the weather report before heading out an hour ago. The smiling face of the weatherman had assured him that the rain wouldn't be arriving in his area until almost midnight, but it was looking like that prediction had been incorrect. Morons. They couldn't predict the weather correctly if their lives depended on it. He decided to keep a close eye on it, but wouldn't deviate from his ritual unless it became apparent he would get drenched. The last time he'd changed it, it had led to him almost giving up on getting back into shape. Walking down, he stepped onto the dock, the wood creaking beneath his feet. The tide was so low this evening that only the last third of the dock actually sat in the water. Once he reached it, it began wobbling slightly back and forth under his gait. The feeling was not only welcomed, it was almost intoxicating. Ever since he'd been a child, he'd been around the ocean and boats. The rocking of the waves had been far more relaxing to him than any crib, and the gentle sound of the waves lapping had long been his version of a lullaby. It was one of the biggest reasons he was saving up money to purchase a boat to live on. He'd already looked into mooring prices down in Charleston and had already set his sights on a Chris Craft Constellation from the 60s. All it would take was a few more years and he would be free from living on land forever. He smiled at the thought as he reached the end and gazed out at the water. He noted with some surprise that there were almost no waves tonight. The estuary was the calmest he'd ever seen since he'd first laid eyes on it. The surface yielded no secrets, the water black and reflecting the final sun rays across, almost as if showing an inverted world through a portal. He pulled his phone out again and pulled up the camera app, deciding he wanted to get a shot of it to send to his friends. Quickly snapping a few photos, he lowered it and looked out again, allowing his mind to empty from all the stressful thoughts that had built up throughout the day. A random saying flicked through his mind as he watched the last traces of red transform into the blue and black hue of the night sky. Red sky at night, sailor's delight. He chuckled to himself. He hadn't heard that saying in years, almost completely forgotten about it. It was a fitting caption, though. Glancing down, he turned his focus to the water. It was even more of an inky black than it had been a few minutes ago, shielding whatever swam beneath it from his prying eyes. His imagination started to wander with almost schoolboyish fervor. He visualized leviathans swimming beneath him, tentacles or claws outstretched towards the surface, cold, unblinking giant eyes piercing through the murk, focused on him, waiting for him to make a careless mistake. Jared reached out and slapped his face lightly, almost in a mocking way. Come on, man, really? You've been obsessed with the ocean your entire life, studied it, even at one point planned to make a career as a marine biologist, and you let your mind start dreaming up monsters like some Middle Ages sailor? You really do have too much free time on your hands. And you've been watching way too many 50s B-horror movies lately. He chuckled slightly at his own thoughts. That's it. I'm not watching It Came from Beneath the Sea for at least 3 months. He turned to walk back up to the beach, but something out of the corner of his eye stopped him. Out towards a series of wooden pilings that marked all that was left of a much older dock, he swore he'd seen a small flash of light from just beneath the surface. He squinted his eyes, straining to focus. For a few moments, there was nothing. Then it came again. A dull, distant hue of red flashed. He never blinked, afraid that if he did, he would miss seeing where it would go. The worry proved fruitless, though, for there it was joined by a second flash of red, then a third. Soon 5 more joined them. What is it? He wondered. A school of jellyfish? I'm not sure if the local species are able to produce their own light. The flashes were beginning to approach the dock, and he leaned over the edge slightly to get a better view. Whap! The water exploded almost directly under him, and the sound snapped in the air like the crack of a whip. Jared had a vague glimpse of something shooting towards his face, and in an almost animal-like instinctive reaction, he shot backwards away from it. Holy cow! He stumbled backwards a few steps before tumbling onto his butt, heart racing so fast that he could feel it straining to burst out of his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he stumbled back to his feet, looking at the end of the dock. Sliding back over the edge, leaving an imprint in the wood from its hooks, was the club end of a tentacle, its flesh a vibrant shade of red. It slid back into the water with a small splash, and silence settled once again over the water, only this time with an air of tension surrounding it. He steadied himself, leaning against a support pylon with one hand and struggling to regain his composure. He forced himself to take slow, deep breaths. In and out, Jared. In and out. Slowly but surely, his heartbeat slowed, his breathing returning to normal. Once he felt more in control of himself, he cautiously took a few steps towards the edge and peered over. A white eye, with a large black pupil, stared back at him with a disinterested gaze. He gasped slightly. A Humboldt squid. A fully grown adult by the looks of it, too. At 8 feet long, it was a formidable predator, with a fearsome reputation of attacking divers and fishermen. The animal gazed at him for another moment, then, with an audible whoosh of water from its siphon, vanished back into the depths. Pulling back, he realized that there were flashes of red all around the dock. There must be an entire school of them in the estuary. He'd heard that they could migrate all the way up to Oregon from Baja anyways, and the fact that they were changing their skin pigment to red signified they were in hunting mode. Probably chasing a school of fish up from Charleston Harbor. It was strange, though, he noted, that one had decided to take a swing at a target above the water. But, he conceded, as much as they had been studied, scientists didn't know everything about them yet. He'd probably seen a behavior that hadn't been really documented before. He made a mental note to write down his findings and send them by mail to the Institute of Marine Biology that was a mile or so away from him. The teachers and students would be interested to read about it, after all, and in a way, he would be keeping his childhood dream job alive. The dock shook under his feet, and he snapped out of his thoughts and looked up. In the fading light, he saw 2 girls about high school age walking down the dock towards the L bend. He looked away a bit, but kept them in his peripheral view as he prepared to head back up and onto the beach. He didn't want either of them making the same mistake he just had. One of them, a blonde that looked about 17, looked up and spotted him. "Hey, you got a light?" she called out. Jared shook his head, and in case she hadn't seen, spoke, "No, sorry." The girl's friend, a brunette, turned to her. "It's okay. I managed to snag my dad's lighter before we left." They both let out a small squeal of laughter, and he shook his head in amusement. Chicks. A second later, a flash of orange light emanated from the brunette's lighter, and a small cloud of smoke drifted over towards him. He smelled the unmistakable scent of weed. "Okay, that's it. I'm getting out of here before the cops decide to swing by here and try and pen me for giving them that." Pushing past the 2 of them with a soft, "Excuse me," he began to head towards shore. He stopped after a few steps, though, turning back around. "Hey, you might want to stay away from the edge of the dock." They both turned to look at him. "Why?" the brunette asked. because I just had a close call with a Humboldt squid before you two came, and there's what looks to be an entire school of them around right now, feeding by the looks of it." The girls looked at him with the blank gazes of two people who knew nothing about sea life. "They're pretty large and can be pretty aggressive when hunting," he added for emphasis. "They have hooks in the suction cups of their tentacles, and their beaks can pierce through metal." He paused before finishing. "And their tentacles can reach out of the water, as I just found out." Now the two girls looked a little more tentative, glancing down at the water uneasily. "I just don't want you guys to have an accident and me not tell you. Just stay away from the edge and you should be fine." The brunette said nothing, but the blonde looked a little grateful. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome. Just be careful and have a good night." He turned to walk away when he heard the girl call back to him. "You be safe, too, if you're staying out here any longer." He turned back to her, a little surprised. "Why?" She hesitated a moment before answering. "You're not from around here, are you? I mean, you weren't born here." "No, I'm not," he answered, now very curious. "Why?" The hesitation came again. "There's been people that have disappeared on this beach at low tide for years. Nobody knows what happens to them, but it's always at night when the tide's out. Even my grandpa says they were happening back in the 40s and 50s. Jared's brow furrowed, his gaze now a little suspicious. The expression on her face seemed genuine, almost fearful, really. But she could simply be a good actress. He rationalized it out in his mind. This chick has to be pulling my leg. She thinks I'm trying to scare her with a squid, and so she decided to get me back with that, especially knowing I'm not a local. He decided not to get into an argument, though, and play it off like he believed her. "I'll be careful," he said with a smile. "Thanks for the heads up." And then, without waiting for a response, he turned away from them and headed up the dock to the beach. Thunder rumbled in the distance as he treaded across the wet sand, his running shoes sinking in slightly. Ducked under the supports of the fishing pier, he began his walk up to the beach. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw lightning flash in the distance. The storm's coming pretty fast. But he reckoned he could make it halfway to his normal turnaround point before having to leave. Looking out to the edge of the water, he saw a heron strutting on long, thin legs through the shallows. It ducked its head low and flashed out, coming back up with a small, silvery fish which it promptly swallowed. Nearby, a few seagulls walked across the mud and sand, others paddling through the water. They let out high-pitched, almost piercingly loud shrieks. Apart from the sounds in the distance, it was the picture of tranquility. These are the moments I'm grateful for in life. Really. All the franticness throughout the day, from working at his job to the occasional argument with his girlfriend, it all melted away here, almost like time seemed to stop. Crunch! He stopped, then looked down at his feet at the metallic sound. Lifting his foot, he saw something glint and bent to pick it up. He used the sleeve of his jacket to wipe away the mud. It was a wristwatch. Not a cheap one either, by the looks of it. The band looked to be real gold, and the glass face had to be strong. It hadn't even cracked under his shoe. Apart from the small covering of mud, it didn't look like it had been out here that long. He glanced around, looking to see if its owner was still on the beach, but there was no sign of anyone apart from himself in either direction. He glanced at the watch and felt a small pang of guilt at the thought which began to reverberate in his mind. Then, with a small shake of his head, he walked down to the edge of the water. Bending down, he swung the watch through the shallows, removing the last of the mud from it, and then stood up again. He pushed his sleeve up his right arm, and then carefully slid the band over his wrist, closing the clasp. He stopped for a second to admire it on his arm. It was actually almost a perfect fit. Well, that's a bit of a lucky find. Probably my best bit of good luck in a long while. He lowered his arm and looked down the beach in the direction he'd been going. He was surprised to find he was almost at the turnaround point. Sheesh, did I really walk that fast down here? The only thing he could think was that his mind had become scatterbrained from finding the watch. Shaking his head to clear the cobwebs, he moved to head back up towards the edge of the beach. His right foot, however, was stuck. Without realizing it, it had slid a little ways into the muck, almost to the top. "Shoot," he hissed. "These are brand new running shoes, dude." Continuing to grumble, he steadied himself with his other foot, rolling up his pant leg slightly, then pulled as hard as he could. The mud made a loud sucking sound as his shoe came loose, and murky water filled in the hole. But his shoe, now stained brown from its excursion, came out. He grimaced as a few flecks hit his exposed ankle, making him shiver from its cold, grimy texture. He extended his leg out and shook it slightly to clear away some of the excess mud. Globs of it flecked off and went in all directions. Something silvery also went flying away, catching his eye. He looked around to locate it, and then bent down to free it from the spot of mud it was stuck in. Standing up, he looked in surprise at it. What the absolute hell? It was what appeared to be an antique glass ring. The band of it was gold, not leaf, but solid, obviously worn from years of contact with seawater. There was a blue sapphire gem in the middle. Lettering marked the outer edges around it. Jared brought the ring close to his face and pulled out his phone to read it in the backlight. Marshfield High School, class of '58. He glanced around at his surroundings, now feeling a little nervous. Finding the watch was one thing, a rare but possible find. But this, especially one so old? No way in hell, man. The tide would have pulled this out to sea long ago. His mind flashed back to the two teenage girls. He was starting to believe that maybe the blonde hadn't been messing with him after all. Looking back to find the lights of the parking lot, which led back to the main street, he saw them about 1.5 miles or so down the beach, along with the outline of the fishing pier. Glancing around, and likely looking a little paranoid to anyone who might be watching, he slipped the ring into his pocket and started back towards it at a rapid pace. Lightning flashed almost directly over his head, making him stop and jump slightly. A loud clap of thunder followed immediately afterwards, and a drop of rain hit his face as he glanced up. Another followed, and before he had a chance to move a foot, the heavens opened. Within 30 seconds, he was completely drenched. Now, feeling thoroughly miserable as well as unnerved, he slogged as fast as he could to his destination. He glanced up, and with almost a small pang of surprise, found that he didn't appear to be any closer to the dull yellow lights. In fact, he was finding it difficult to pick his legs up at all. Glancing down, he realized that the mud, now becoming soggier from the torrential rain, was causing his feet to sink. Pulling hard to free himself, both came loose with a loud slop. He increased his pace, feeling a little more paranoid. He could not describe why, but he felt watched, like someone was observing him. He looked up towards the tall grass and the dark, hulking shapes of the houses lining the shore. There was no one, nothing to either side of him either, but he felt eyes on him. He quickened his pace, keeping his gaze focused on the lights. They seemed to become brighter. Yes, I'm getting closer. He raised one hand over his head to pump into the air in happiness. But as he did, his left leg sank into the soft mud to the knee. Jared flew forward, his face slamming into the mud. His mouth was filled with the disgusting taste of it. A second later, He tasted blood as well. Raising his head, he realized it was coming from his nose. He looked up again to regain his bearings. Something stared back at him, less than 6 inches away from his face. It was too dark to see any features, but it was unmistakably a face. Jared shrieked and scrambled backward until he was stopped by his leg, the sound lost to another clap of thunder. His mind was in full fight-or-flight mode, only thinking about getting away from what he was sure he'd seen. Yanking as hard as he could, he felt his foot slide out of his shoe and out of the hole. He pushed backwards until he was on his feet, on what felt like solid ground. The white sock on his bare foot had become brown. He glanced around frantically. No one knelt or stood near the hole. He spun around in a circle. Still nobody. Trying to force himself to remain calm, he looked up again and felt a dull sense of shock overtake him. He was still no closer to the parking lot. "Okay, what the hell?" he shouted. "What the hell is going on?" He started to breathe heavily, then forced himself to move forward. "You're not going to die out here." He repeated it over and over again, almost like a mantra. After a minute, he almost started to believe it, too. That was when he stepped into another deep hole. This time it was his right leg that was swallowed up. It sank to the calf before stopping. He stumbled forward, but didn't fall this time. Instead, he fought, trying to pull his leg out from the muck. He felt his foot begin to slide out from his shoe, but then abruptly it stopped. He pulled harder, trying to figure out what was preventing him from pulling it out. He wiggled his toes and found that he could not feel the sides of his shoe. That meant he'd already slipped out of it. He pulled again, then felt a sudden, small pressure slide around his ankle. Puzzlement crossed his face for a split second before being wiped away, almost as if by the rain, to be replaced with almost primal horror. Something was grabbing his ankle. Almost in response to the revelation, he felt the grip tighten and begin to pull. Jared threw back his head and let out a scream that he almost couldn't believe came from his own voice. He began kicking back and forth wildly, trying to force whatever had a hold of him to let go. But it didn't. Instead, it only gripped tighter, almost painfully so, and continued to pull. His leg began to slip deeper into the mud, past the calf, to the knee. He knew he had precious little time to break free before he passed the point of no return. He shook his foot more violently and pulled with all his might. Whatever gripped him must have been surprised by his ferocity, because its hold loosened, just enough for him to rip his ankle from its grasp and pull out of the mud. This time there was no sucking sound, and it left a perfectly round hole in the mud. He thought he saw something begin to ferociously claw its way up the hole, something he sensed was beyond pissed. But he didn't wait around to find out. He broke into a full sprint, willing his body to use all of the available energy left to get to the parking lot. As he ran, his mind flashed with a simple thought. "They want the things I took back." Not slowing, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. He didn't pick a direction. He cocked his arm back and then let it fly away from him into the darkness. "You want this back?" he screamed in no general direction. "Take it! Just take it and leave me alone, please! I'm sorry!" He fumbled with the clasp on the watch, hearing sounds begin to come from the mud all around him and not daring to look. Feeling the clasp break, he flung the watch away as well. His sides were beginning to ache, and his lungs felt as though they were on fire, but he kept running, his eyes locked onto the lights. Tears of relief filled his eyes as he saw they finally seemed to be drawing closer. A ghost of a smile played around his lips. He was almost out of there. Jamming his hand into his other pocket, he pulled out his phone, grateful his girlfriend had bought him a waterproof case for it last year. "I've got to call the cops," he screamed to himself. "I've got to get to safety and call the cops and tell them." His thoughts about calling the police shattered as he fell. His stomach slammed against something hard, and the phone tumbled from his hand, bouncing once before embedding itself in the mud, its screen bright and facing straight at him. He struggled to comprehend what had happened, and the lightning flashed again, twice in quick succession. Flash! He had fallen into the biggest hole he'd ever seen in the mud. It had swallowed him up to his hips. A horrifying realization swam through his mind. A trap. Flash! As he looked up, he once again saw the visage that had scared him half to death, staring down at him. This time, it was clearly visible in the flash of lightning. And with that flash, also went Jared's sanity, for the face he stared into was inhuman in both its appearance and its sinister, malevolent sneer. He felt the grip around his ankle once more, only this time it was joined by half a dozen others, ones that tore at his legs and gripped the bottom of his jacket. He fought to escape their grip, but this time he was too deep to pull himself out. He dug his hands into the mud with a death grip and began to scream for help. But, almost as if giving a cruel sense of irony, a huge clap of thunder rumbled at the same moment, drowning out his cries. More things grabbed his back, and he felt himself begin to slide backwards into the hole, which had begun to fill back up with a mixture of mud and water. The sting of tears joined the pounding of the rain on his face, and he flung his head back and screamed again, this one wordless and filled with a howl of desperation. But he felt the largest grip of all wrap around his torso and pull harshly down. His fingernails were torn as his hands were yanked out of their handholds, leaving trails of blood to mix with the rain. As his shoulders disappeared beneath the mud, he opened his mouth a final time to scream. "Oh, good Lord, please tell me it's not another one." The man looked up from his 6-year-old daughter to see who had spoken. A small, rather frail elderly woman with wispy white hair stood a few feet away from him, one he saw on a regular basis. "Afraid so, Jazz," he replied grimly. They both turned to stare in silence at the scene before them. The edge of the beach was roped off with yellow tape, and about 5 or 6 police cars gathered on the edge near the fishing pier. Officers milled around on the other side, some scurrying back and forth to their patrol vehicles to fetch things. A Coast Guard boat was anchored near the shoreline. The divers were being sent into the water. A young woman stood near the pier, bent almost in half and weeping, while an officer attempted to comfort her. A few dozen yards away, the local news van was parked, a cameraman and reporter filming their piece for the evening's segment. Nearby were a few others for the local papers and radio stations. Jazz looked at the man again, her eyes filled with sorrow and anguish. She had been dealing with such happenings all her life. Too damn long, she thought. "Who was it this time?" she asked. In response, the man reached down and turned up the volume on a portable radio at his feet. The voice of the newscaster jumped out from it. "And if you're just tuning in, folks, police have cordoned off the Empire boat ramp and adjoining parking lot at the corner of Newmarket and Cape Arago Highway to search for a young man reported missing early this morning. Jared Dellinger, age 29, was last seen walking along the beach at 9:30 last night, and police were notified by his significant other when he failed to return home by dawn. Details are coming few and far between, as it is an ongoing investigation, but police are asking that anyone who may know of Dellinger's whereabouts to contact the Coos Bay Police Department immediately. This disappearance marks the 8th one this year, of which the area has become infamous over the last 80 years for its unusual amount of disappearing men, women, and children. We will attempt to update you on this story as it unfolds. In state news, Governor Kotek... The man clicked the radio off and looked at her. That's all they're officially saying, but I found out a few other details from one of my cop friends. The woman waited for a moment before pressing. For God's sake, John, tell me! He sighed before looking at the scene in front of them again and continuing, keeping his grip tight on his daughter's hand. He said they found the young man's cell phone stuck in the mud about 500 feet from the edge. It was as if he'd pulled it out to call someone but dropped it. They also found one of his shoes buried in a deep hole. They haven't found the other yet, but... He trailed off and looked to be in deep thought before finishing. The biggest reason that there are this many police down here is because near where they found the man's phone, they found a watch and a ring. Neither belonged to him, from what I'm told. In fact, he turned to face Jazz, his face grim. The watch belonged to that upper-class banker who disappeared last summer. And the ring belonged to Jeffrey Sims. Jazz felt the color drain from her face as the realization sunk in. Jeffrey Sims? She stammered. As in, the Jeffrey Sims, who disappeared with his prom date in 1958? John nodded slowly. The very same. They're thinking this might link those disappearances to it, so they're coming out in full force. The word is they're calling in the state troopers as well. The feds might even reopen their cold cases. Jazz looked at the ground, her voice weak with resignation and fear. They'll never find any other trace of any of them, you know. They never do. All they'll do is make a show of it to calm everyone down. John nodded again, picking up his radio from the ground. I know, he said softly, before turning to her. I know, he sighed. I should be getting home, Jazz. You should too. The old woman nodded sadly, giving one final forlorn look at the scene in front of her before turning away, hobbling quickly back to her car. John watched her get in and drive away, then looking down at his young daughter. Come on, Lizzie, darling, we're going home. His gaze lingered again on the searching officers. And we are not coming back here anymore. The little girl nodded and looked back at the police as she allowed her father to lead her away. She didn't really know what was going on, only that it was very serious. She'd heard her daddy talk with the old woman from the grocery store about it, using words she didn't know the meanings to yet. She would never tell him, but she was secretly happy they wouldn't be coming back, because she didn't like it here. She didn't like the way that she always felt watched by people she couldn't see when she played. She didn't like the fact that she sometimes lost her toys and couldn't find them again. But the thing she hated the most about this beach was how so much of the mud had formed to look like faces. Faces that were always screaming. The ocean strikes again. The danger is moving unsettlingly close to the shore, isn't it? And wouldn't you know it, I've actually been to Coos Bay. It's a lovely place, if you ignore the monsters along the shore. Great for metal detecting, I'm told, if you stay well inland or have an appetite for danger. Did you know there are all kinds of creatures that burrow into the sand at beaches? Usually I prefer not to think about it to maintain the illusion, but it's true. Most of them are very small, but it's fun and freaky to imagine something larger in there, just waiting for you to step on it, so it can cleave off a bit of dinner. If you enjoyed this story, please check out the author in the links below, or Enjoy another one of his stories that I'll link in the end cards in just a moment. Please also leave a like on this video and subscribe for more stories like this one. Whatever you do, be mindful of where you put your feet and don't fall asleep.